So hello again to everybody, and welcome to Estonian Tallinn. Actually, we're doing this live from Tallinn, and welcome to the workshop number 4, Men, Masculinities, and Aging. My name is Häli Tarum. I'm actually the head of Social Welfare Department from the Ministry of Social Affairs from Estonia, and I also work at university as a researcher. And our current workshop aims to look at the topic of masculinity and aging from different angles. First, we have 2 presentations that we call, so to say, food for thought. We have here Miranda from the Goethe University, Frankfurt. Then following, we have a presentation by Naoki Kondo from Kyoto University, School of Public Health. Following Miranda and Naoki, we have a presentation by Jose Armango, who will give us an overview of the international project Message. And then we have Kaupo Lõhmus from Estonia. And we will finish up our panel workshop with Christine Milligan from Lancaster University. So a few words about the structure of the workshop. We have 15 minutes per presentation, and for all the panelists, please share your screen and turn on your microphone when you start your presentation. And I try to be here the referee, and I will try to remind you when you have your last 2 minutes for conclusion. And please respect the time for all the participants. In the end of all the presentations, we have time for live questions. But you can also ask your questions already in the Zoom chat. Or you can also add any comments or thoughts to the chat. And my assistant Agnes here, say hi Agnes, where are you? Agnes here.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. Agnes here will collect the questions and thoughts in the end of all the panelists, and then we can ask questions. And also you can use the raise your hand button or action. It should be here somewhere in Zoom. So I'm really pleased to introduce our first panelist, Miranda Lentovic. She is a senior researcher at the Working Group Interdisciplinary Aging Research at the Goethe University, Frankfurt. She has obtained her PhD at Royal Holloway University of London and has worked at University College London and St. George's University. Her research interests are gender and masculinity in later life, health and self-care in later life, and qualitative methods. So Miranda will introduce us the research on the role of empowerment and aging in the lives of older men living alone. So Miranda, please, floor is yours.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Good, lovely. Okay, right. I've given my talk the title, Aging Men as Changing Men, Caring Masculinities in Later Life, to look at whether there are shifts in the construction of masculinity and in the kind of activities older men are involved in that could be related to care, and how that that is linked to specific setup in later life. Now, why won't to change? That's it. Okay. So to start off, I want to give a bit of a background to where I am conceptually with my work, and we'll look at age and gender relations in later life, and then look at the concept of caring masculinities. And then I'll move on to the empirical part, where I introduce the study ALMA, Older Men Living Alone. I'll introduce the sample and what we found there, give you the summary of what we found, and then I have 3 statements as food for thought, maybe for the discussion later on. Right. Aging and gender, as I guess we all know in this panel, are social categories that are continuously produced and reproduced with variations depending on time and place. And this is nothing new. This is work that was big with Weston Zimmerman with Doing Gender. And this concept of social construction of gender has been translated to aging as well. So trying to shift aging out from a biological perspective, from a medical perspective of decline, cell decline, and all that kind of thing, to actually say, how are the lives of older people constructed? What kind of images of aging do we have? How do they change? What influences are there? And what does that mean at an individual level? How do people react to images of aging and to societal expectations of aging? If we want to understand age and aging, it is absolutely necessary to consider it in its intersections with other social categories. I've already mentioned gender, but there's also, of course, ethnicity, race, disability, among many others. I also locate the work within masculinity studies, so looking at the power relations among men, but also between men and women, and again in relation to social categories, which has been conceptualized by Connell and Messerschmidt as hegemonic masculinities, a very useful concept that has of course also had a lot of critical work done around it, but that is not easily transferred or usable for looking at masculinities in later life, because most people are outside of productive norms, outside of the labor market, and that makes this concept a little bit difficult to transfer to later life. The work of Jeff Hearn is quite helpful here, who talks about later life men experiencing privileges because of their gender. So that continues, something that we could say actually also fits with the hegemonic masculinity concept, but due to age, they also experience marginalization. And that is a sort of something that they move between, and it has to be looked at specifically over time. For my work in particular, I work strongly with the concept of the third age, looking at it critically, but I think it's very important to understand the changes we see in terms of images of aging and actually the kinds of lives people are living currently. And if you look at the third age from a concept, it sort of starts with Laslet's work, looking at the post-World War II cohorts that have moved into later life and who are living a very different later life than we know from previous cohorts. And Paul Higgs and Chris Gilliard have looked at the influence of consumption, of education, of cultural contexts that these cohorts have taken into old age and have not given up, and who are also resisting being pushed into a marginalized social category. So with this work in mind, against this backdrop, agency becomes a sort of a key function of looking at later life. You know, what kind of agency is available to older people, and also where do they actually have agency? Pressing the wrong button. Another concept I'd like to look at is caring masculinities. It has its roots in critical studies on men and masculinities and feminist care theory. And Hanlon is one central researcher here who, based on studies on fatherhood, has looked at the absence of care in traditional constructions of masculinities. So he says care is defined as feminine, doing care means enacting a feminized identity, care is seen as something men are bad at, care means relinquishing the power associated with traditional masculinity. And Clara Elliott, who's really contributed to making the concept of caring masculinities quite dominant lately, defines caring masculinities as the rejection of domination and their integration of values of care, such as positive emotion, interdependence, and relationality into masculine identities, and in doing so recast traditional masculine values like protection and providing, which the last two, protection and providing, quite often could be also seen as caring. But of course, if they're associated with strong power relationships of one person, a man, being more powerful than other, let's say, family members, then that is not the kind of caring that Eliot is talking about. Eliot also draws on the work of Anderson, who makes a distinction between caring for and caring about. So caring for as the practical tasks of care, and caring about the effective emotional relations of care. And what Eliot argues is that, particularly for men, if they get pushed into caring for whatever reason, because they have to fulfill a parental role, because they're looking after someone nobody else can look after, that would be a partner, a wife, whoever, in the process of getting into those practical tasks of care work, there is then an emotional involvement. So caring for then shifts into caring about. Scholz and Laufenberg in Germany have also been working on the concept of caring masculinities, and they've been a bit more critical about the work of Eliot, and have questioned this connection with identity. And their argument is that would be maybe more helpful to use the concept of caring masculinities to investigate the power relationships in the care work of men. So to look at how do they shift over time, especially in this idea of caring for and caring about, and in how far do traditional notions of masculinity about protection and providing still play a role in caring masculinities. So with that as a background, I would like to move on to the project we conducted. So when we started off in 2017, the general idea was to map the experiences of men living alone in later life, as well as the services available to them in an urban setting such as Frankfurt Main. So we did a scoping review of social, educational, and cultural services in Frankfurt. We did 5 qualitative stakeholder interviews with service providers and 4 qualitative narrative interviews with older men living alone. I conducted these interviews, and what I'll be presenting today is based on those interviews. I interviewed the men twice. I went to visit them twice, with usually 6 to 8 weeks between the 2 interviews. I interviewed them at home. So for today, the question is, how does care work as a form of agency feature in the lives of older men living alone? And if you're interested in hearing a bit more about it, we have been able to publish this research. So here's the sample. We went for a maximum variation sample. We have 4 men. The youngest was 69 at the time of the interview, and the oldest was 88. They have very varying family status. So Herr Rost was unmarried, had been in long-term relationships, and was currently in an LAT, living apart together, relationship for 12 years. Herr Ön was divorced and in stable relationships. Herr Färber was widowed. He was in an LAT relationship for 10 years, and Herr Willershäuser was unmarried and single since 1980s. He opened the interview by saying that he was homosexual and that he had known about this since a very young age, and he made this very explicit in the interview. So they varied in terms of children, education levels, financial situation. It's interesting to see that 2 had good financial situation through their working career, whereas 2 had actually quite precarious income levels, but were able to get into good financial situation actually in later life due to safe pension schemes. And they had varying social networks, either very family-based or a combination of family and friends. Herr Ön was the one who basically was very explicit about the fact that he felt incredibly lonely and that he only really had access to acquaintances. So I will take you through the kind of care work the men were involved in, the meanings that they attached to this care work, and how I think it is embedded from what I could hear from their biographies. So Herr Rost actually was interesting in the sense that between the first interview and the second interview, his long-term partner had an operation and was immobile. And they decided that she would move into his flat, and she spent 6 or even 7 weeks being looked after him. So he took over all her care needs, and he had just finished that when we did the second interview. In this context, he described himself as Krankenschwester, which is the German word for a female nurse. And when I questioned him about this female name that he'd given himself, he basically said, his care work was so encompassing and so time-consuming and emotionally consuming that he could only equate it with female care work. There was no equivalent male care work he could come up with. However, the two of them had promised themselves reciprocal care should they ever need it, so it was clear that he would do this. And he was also very curious about how this caring and living together was going to work out, given the fact that he hadn't lived with a partner in decades. I think his meanings that he attached to care and the way he presented himself was very much attached to his professional work. He was in the field of adult education, and he'd had a long-term experiences of psychotherapy and of other therapeutic approaches that he also used in his work. So he was very reflexive and was able to sort of see how what he was doing was embedded in different kinds of psychological concepts. Then we have Herr I forgot to mention that he came to Germany in his early 20s, has lived in Germany ever since. During his later adult years, his mother came to move in with him in Germany. She stayed with him for 8 years, but she was already quite ill at the time and needed care. Not all day, but he looked after her. She didn't leave the flat much. She only then left it after 8 years to go back to Turkey, where she died. And he has a close friend who has moved into a care home recently, and he visits him very regularly. Now, the care work for his mother seemed to produce some kind of contradiction to him, to his traditional construction of masculinity, despite the fact that he also was very involved with his work in political work on gender equality. And somehow he couldn't square the two. So he actually kept the fact that he was looking after his mother over a considerable amount of time secret. He hardly told anyone. In fact, he told his pupils that sometimes he had to go home early because he had to look after his cat. The visit of the friend in the care home has quite a meaningful bond to him. They were very close. It also involves providing his friend with alcohol, which is scarce in the care home. Then we have Herr Färber. He is a sort of traditional member of this sample. He had been married for a long time. His wife died. In the church community, he found his new partner. They've been together for over 10 years. However, in the last few years, she developed dementia. So he cared for his wife during her terminal illness. And now in the last 2-3 years, he's been looking after his partner. They don't live together. She lives in a flat attached to her daughter's, or next to her daughter's flat. He sees her not quite every day during the week, but he spends all weekends with her. They go for very, very small outings. He makes sure she eats and takes her medication, and they spend a lot of time together. He also visits 6 friends and acquaintances from his local community who have now live in care homes, some of whom don't recognize him anymore, but he feels he can't give them up. He very much downplays his care work. He says it's a sense of duty that he has taken on, and it also, especially these visits in the care home settings, very much structure his day. All of this is embedded in a deep sort of Christian ethics that very much framed his marriage, his large family structure with 4 children, 8 grandchildren, I don't know how many great-grandchildren, and his sense of duty towards these friends from the church community and the local community he visits. And then finally, Herr Willershäuser, he looks after a friend in a care home. He visits him very regularly, most weekends as well. He massages him, he cuts his hair, he sews him clothes. This friend is paraplegic, so he tries to, make things as good as he can for him. It has to be added that this man is obviously some unrequited love of his, whom he could never have a relationship with, but now, due to this caring relationship, he can at least sort of live it in that sense. He also runs a huge amount of errands for his sister, his cousin, both already very old as well, in their late 80s, his neighbors, the landlady, the local bookshop owner. This too gives him an incredible daily structure and continuity, and is somehow connected to his work in logistics. I think this sort of organizing things, shifting things, very much connected to his former work, and obviously this close emotional relationship he has with his friend is connected with his homosexuality. So looking at a summary, really, we know that these men lived alone. Having said that, it doesn't mean that they are alone. They can be in meaningful relationships. In fact, all of them were. Caring for others involved push factors, but also pull factors. And I think this was something that struck us in the research, that these men were not actually necessarily pushed into these situations. They actually sought out people and situations where they could somehow look after someone else. So they are definitely on this continuum of caring for and caring about. Their care work had multiple meanings. And on the one hand, it helped them in the process of aging, in particular finding some kind of meaningful activity. It's worth noting that all four men had a very difficult transition from labor participation to retirement. They all had considerable health problems, and it took some time to get over it. And finding some kind of meaningful activity isn't that easy. We know that from retirement research. And this was obviously something that they could indulge in. And also the care work helped them with the living alone, in the sense that it maintained their independence. It maintained their independence in a way that they had to organize themselves to do all this kind of work. It also was used as a representation outwards to show other people, I am looking after other people. I certainly do not need other people looking after me. The men's biographies are very important in understanding the care work they do, and also the meanings that they attach to that care work. And when I say men's biographies, I really also mean the social and cultural contexts in which their biographies were shaped and happened need to be looked at. And caring masculinities as a concept allows an examination of how the men oscillate essentially between their gendered privileges of being able to see care as women's work, but also sort of taking this women's work on as a way of agency in a life stage that actually has shrinking possibilities. And food for thought, I'm trying to take this now to a slightly bigger level, and some of this is provocative. I hope we can discuss it. Sort of older men living alone and caring for others contribute to gender equality in small ways. The care work that older men do need to be recognized, but should not distract from the care work that women do. There's sometimes this call for public recognition. I see that quite critically. And then in terms of lifelong learning, older men should be supported in reflexive work that helps them recognize their lifelong dependency on care work by others. And with that, I will end, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Miranda, for the presentation, and thanks for the food for thought ideas. We will come back to those after all the presentations. And next one is we have Naoki Kondo here. who is actually a professor of social epidemiology at the Department of Social Epidemiology and Global Health at Kyoto University. His primary research themes are social determinants of health. He is the vice chief investigator of the Japan Gerontological Evaluation Study, which is a cohort study following up more than 200,000 older adults nationwide in Japan. And his recent study focuses on how to address health inequality in the community settings and how to conducting intervention studies with local and center governments. So Naoki, could you please give us some more insight into the study that you've been working on? Thank you.
Yes, just a second. Time. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Naoki Kondo from Kyoto University. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? All right. Hello. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Good. Yes. So I'm Naoki Kondo from Kyoto University. I'm a physician and social epidemiologist, and I'm not a sociologist. So I want to show some of the evidence we have created about the older people's health. And I put, this is a takoyaki. Takoyaki is octopus ball in Japan. Some of you may know that this is the best snack for beer, and I ate yesterday. And why I show this picture? So this is why I found the interesting gendered message at the takoyaki shop last night. This is two messages on the wall, and that said like the discipline of men, and somehow this represents Japanese sense of masculinity in Japanese society. And the message say, you may have some troubles, you may want to complain about them, you may feel annoyed about that, you may want to cry, but if you are a man, just be patient and not to do them like that. The four discipline of women, do not think that you are only one who has hardships. Everyone has them. Do not try to get the better of men and keep working hard like that. This, my generation doesn't follow this mostly, but for the older generations, they may have this kind of sense still even now. And I think this is related to some of the evidence I will show about the older people's health statuses and gender differences in health statuses somehow. So the social epidemiology is a branch of epidemiology studying social determinants of health. We provide the knowledge base for controlling health inequality. And gender is, in social epidemiology, is a very well-known important determinant of health. And it's a very important topic of the study in social epidemiology. I'm not a gender studies specialist, but some of the evidence is always related to gender. So this is a traditional study about the disaster of the Titanic study, and showing that the huge inequality in survivorship across the cabin classes and also by genders, you can see. So but this is traditional evidence, but we can witness the similar, health inequality across social classes even now. And in Japan, the health inequality across occupation is one of another important topic in social epi. And for Japan, when Japanese society experienced a serious financial crisis called Asian financial crisis, and we have observed very somehow peculiar patterning in health inequality. This is a result for men. And before the crisis, and the managers, the corporate managers, mortality risk of them is the least across all occupations. Their risk is less than other occupations, including professionals and others like manual laborers, transporters, or like that. But after the crisis onset, the patterning completely changed. And our observation reveals that the crisis killed the managers the most after the crisis for some reasons. And the patterning is most remarkably represented in suicide. And after the economic crisis, the managers committed suicide the most. And we don't have the direct evidence about the reasons of this patterning, but we speculate that this is closely related to the hegemonic masculinity concept prevailing in Japanese working people. And I mean, the many managers of the companies feel like we have to be patient and we have to commit on the companies and their families and as much as possible like that. And the stress of them is very high after the crisis, and some of them may commit suicide. So this is the story for the working age. The part about after the retirement. So in Japan, we have the famous word called wet fallen leaves. I don't know, you guys have the same meaning in this word, and do you know the meaning of them? And that is like sticking on their wife after the retirement. And do nothing at home, and just like representing the sad conditions of the retired men in Japan. So one of my respectable public health physicians said, after retirement, men become vulnerable in the community or at home. And I think this is related to the number of communities they belong among men and women who have traditional gender role perspectives. So in working age, men are strictly working at home, working at workplaces, and they only have two communities, that is workplaces and family or home. On the other hand, women have multiple communities that can be family, local community, and personal friends in the community and school of children. There is a big gap here. After retirement, it is of course men lose workplace as a community. So the men only have the family as a community. And that means the wife. So they have to stick on her and become the wet fallen leaves. Yeah. So our statistics also support this thing, and the men less likely to participate in the local community activities according to our nationwide survey. Oh, sorry. And less than half of men participate in the local activities like hobby group activities and sports groups or like that. Compared to women, but women, the 60% participate some of those community activities. This is another evidence that in Japan, to prevent functional disability of older people, Japanese government promoted the local actions about making so-called community salons. That is like the social gathering places run by local older volunteers. And the volunteers organized those social gathering opportunities in the community and invite like living along older people and like do what they want anywhere, anything. And to our experimental study, so we found that those who participate in the community salon are less likely to develop a functional disability. So this is a good news that this kind of intervention can be effective in preventing functional disability. But the problem is most of the participants are women, and more than 80% is women, and only 20% of men participated in the community, this kind of activity. So if promoting this kind of interventions, so this can widen the health inequality by gender. So how to address this issue or promoting the participation of men is very important for Japanese society. So how to address this issue? So according to the World Health Organization, they recommended 3 things. One is improving daily living conditions and targeting structural causes in the social environment rather than just providing the messages like do more exercises or having a good diet, but change the social environment. And to do so, the health sector cannot change those structural causes by themselves. So the strengthening governance and making good partnership by organizations are very important to provide more supports for vulnerable populations. And to make a governance, it is also important to utilize data, basically the objective data to understand the problems and assessing the impacts of actions. So doing these 3 things is important, maybe. So we conducted the intervention study involving the more than 30 municipalities in Japan who are participating in our study cohort study. So basically, we have provided its so-called community diagnosis sheet that includes the data about the distributions of health statuses among older people within the municipalities, within each municipality, and the between municipality comparisons about the health statuses. But we also found that most of the municipalities cannot use the data in an effective way. So then in 2009, 2013, we selected 16 municipalities and provided extra support for the health sector officials and assisting them in organizing intersectoral meeting on aging policies, and also supporting to utilize community health data with local people's groups to promote their voluntary activities about the increasing the participations of older men and women in the community who can be socially isolated. So our hypothesis comes from the community coalition action theory. This is one of the action models for health promotion activity in the community. So, I mean, the researchers provide support for health sector staff members, and they in creating some coalition partnerships between other sectors and the local citizens. Then their skills for policy planning, leadership, assessment, and partnerships building is increasing. Then the collaborative synergy may be created and community capacity enhanced. And finally, they may result in more healthy actions or achieving health equity. So what's the results? And we have followed up those municipalities, the residents, for 3 years. And the result is like this. Among the intervention municipalities, men increased the proportion of participating in local activities more than those who are living in control groups, municipalities. For women, their participation rate is already high at the baseline, so they don't change, their participation rate doesn't change. So in other meaning, so the intervention successfully increased the vulnerable men in the community. They didn't participate in the local activities. Surprisingly, this is effective in their survivorship or the reducing mortality in the men in the intervention municipalities. And only for men, we have the differential impact and the improvement in the risk of mortality among men in intervention municipality compared to control municipalities. So this is a conclusion. So the crisis, whatever it is, a natural disasters or man-made disaster like financial crisis anyway, or whatever, so that widens the health gap. But sometimes it worsens the health of privileged populations like corporate managers. in the period of a crisis, they can be the vulnerable populations. And in the case of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, that happens because perhaps due to the hegemonic masculinity among Japanese male managers. The partnerships beyond health sectors are critical to address gender inequality in health. So improving social environment with better understandings of gender-specific behavior of the people in Japanese and other societies, which is, I think, important. And to do so, using the objective data is also useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naoki. Thanks a lot for your presentation. And for the new participants, as Agnes already texted into the chat, we take the questions after all the presentations. But you can still add your questions already to the chat, or you could put your ideas or thoughts, whatever you come up with during the presentations. But to try to be in schedule, that's why I'm hurrying up here. So next we have Jose Armango with us. Jose Armango is actually a senior lecturer in American literature and gender studies at the University of Castilla-La Mancha, Spain. And he has published on literary representation of masculinity in prestigious academic journals such as Science, Critique, Men and Masculinities, and so on. His latest books include Embodying Masculinities, Alternative Masculinities for Changing World, Masculinities in Black and White and Aging, Masculinities in Contemporary US Fiction. Currently, he is the coordinator of the EU-funded research project on masculinities and aging in contemporary European literature and cinemas. And please, Jose, could you give us a short overview of the project and where are you at the moment with it? Thank you.
Jose, can you please unmute yourself?
Now? No?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you so much for your introduction. Basically, I'll be trying to present here very briefly the ongoing work which we're carrying out with a group of social scientists and humanities scholars in Europe from different EU countries who are working together basically on this project, which is titled Gender in Age, Representations of Masculinities and Aging in Contemporary European Literatures and Cinemas. The MASCAGE is the acronym. You have the webpage address here if anyone is interested. And basically, this project is fundamentally basically came across basically because of a number of it emerged at the intersection, at the crossroads of gender studies and aging studies also. So basically what we notice is that in the field of gerontology, little attention had been traditionally paid to gender and masculinity studies. In the same way as regards age studies, most of the attention had traditionally been paid to young people, to younger cohorts. And so basically, in the case of age studies, there was this focus on youth, on younger people. And in the case of aging studies, it was obviously a field which had traditionally been devoted to the study of older people, but older people usually meant, as we found out, older women, either older women or men's studies lacking a specific gender perspective, what Edward Thompson calls gendered studies of aging. So basically, because of this, we realized we found this critical gap in the literature, in the sense that most gerontological studies could be defined as somehow genderless. Obviously, this is changing slowly. There is more and more work being done in the area. But traditionally, gerontological studies had treated men and women as a homogeneous group. In the same way as, and on the other hand, actually, gender studies had traditionally been, in many cases, could be described as ageless, in the sense that especially men were treated or had been traditionally treated as a homogeneous group. So that when we're talking about men, usually we mean middle-aged males. So that what Connell himself in his 1995 book, Masculinities, referred to as hegemonic masculinity, which the first presenter already sort of introduced to. So basically, we found ourselves at this, we found ourselves that there was very little attention being paid to the study of older men as men, that is to say, older men as gendered being, from the specific perspective of masculinity studies. And also, what we found out, with most of our work actually comes from the social sciences and the humanities. I myself, I'm a humanities scholar in literature and film studies. And what we found is that the little work which had been done on older men had traditionally been derived either from sociological or biomedical sources. So for example, we have this book, a classic book, which is called Older Men's Lives by Edward Thompson from 1994, which is a sociological study of older men, or for example, Aging Men, Masculinities and Modern Medicine, which had this more like biomedical focus, basically how to prolong or how to improve men's health, older men's health. So these were basically the fundamental books and foci or angles which we came up with. So basically in this project, we had these three main objectives, which were first of all, to analyze again the intersections between masculinity studies and aging studies, which we found that was very much needed because little work, as I said, had been done on the area compared to, for example, women's studies, feminism, or older women. To rethink also older men and masculinities, specifically from the humanities, cultural, literary, and film studies angle. Basically, as I said, most of the work had been carried out in the sociological or medical sciences. And basically, again, this was already mentioned before, but the idea of exploring the need to explore the intersections between aging and other social categories, for example, ethnicity, class, or sexuality, disability, and so on and so forth, so that we found that intersectionality was central. That if we really wanted to understand the issue of aging, we had to analyze that in context, that it was not an isolated category, but that a category which actually intersected with other, basically factors. Now, as I said, reviewing the literature, the first implications that we came up with was that basically most of the work on aging, which had been carried out so far from a gender perspective, had been about, and actually also by women. So for example, in his 1970s classic article called The Double Standard of Aging, Susan Sontag, for example, asserted that growing old affects women much more than men. In another study, classic study by Betty Friedan, The Fountain of Age, published in the 1990s, she suggested that women are kept from growing. And more recently, Lynn Siegel, a British psychologist, suggested in Out of Time, a book published in 2013, that it is women who have often reported a very specific horror of aging. So that basically there was this focus on women whenever the issue of gender was mentioned in relation to older people. Now, in our study, however, we began to explore the specific implications for older men, basically the implications of masculinity to other men, as well as the implications of aging to men themselves. And so just to illustrate historically, so to say, we went back to the roots, the historical roots of the associations of aging, of the connections, intersections of aging and gender. We came up with this, we came up with lots of evidence suggesting that there was this close, though often veiled, connection between the two categories. And so, for example, we came up with this study by Charles Brown-Séquard, who was a very famous professor and researcher at the laboratory at the Collège de France, in which he conducted this experiment basically in 1889. We're talking obviously historically about the end of the 19th century. But basically this scholar realized that fragility, he said, and this has been published and was considered to be science at the time. It's not, today it sounds like funny, but it was considered to be scientific evidence at the time. Fragility, he said, was common to other men and eunuchs. And so basically in 1889, for 15 days, when he was already 72 years old, we can imagine that he had some troubles aging too by the time he published the book, the article, sorry. He decided to conduct this experiment, this issue, in which he got this extract from the testicles of guinea pigs and dogs. And basically, he decided to inject this, basically this extract to several older men, because he thought that basically this could sort of rejuvenate older men and to help them recover their masculinity, their virility. And actually he said that indeed he had proven that he was right, that basically this worked. And actually he proved that through the evidence that these older men, after the injections, they got more energy. And the evidence he provided is that the urinary stream for these men had increased by 25%, okay? And so he came up with this conclusion. He said that if it were possible to inject, quote, without danger, and I would underline the word because we'll see now the implications for that, sperm into the veins of old men, one would be able to obtain with them some manifestation of rejuvenation at once with respect to intellectual work and physical powers of the organism, okay? And so he continued his experiment. He thought he was right, and he kept fabricating, producing this extract from also bull testicles. I think it's very significant also symbolically, the type of animals he came up, you know, he chose for the experiment, because, you know, bulls have traditionally been seen as, you know, the epitome of masculinity, right? And so basically he took these bull testicles to stop aging. He actually produced 200,000 injections, which he called this essence, he called the essence of masculinity, okay? Obviously, as you can imagine, little by little, he was proven wrong, okay? That this didn't actually work. And actually, first of all, he was ridiculed by other doctors. These experiments were ridiculed as senile aberrations by other scholars. There were even some caricatures published in several journals. Here you can see an example of a tiger who is about to be castrated in order to produce the essence of masculinity for these older men. And also because of the placebo effect, basically, and actually the experiment came suddenly to an end when there was this blood poisoning, which basically was the final, you know, drop. You know, and basically after that, we also know that it didn't work much to prolong his life, because Brown-Séquard himself died 3 years later at the age of 75. Okay, but I think it's important this kind of anecdotal image to illustrate the historical cultural connections between masculinity and aging, and more specifically, aging as feminizing for men, in a way in which older men have been proven to be less manly than younger men, less virile. Okay, now. As I said, I come from the humanities, so most of my examples are going to be have been taken also from literary texts and movies. And just to give you an example, I don't know if you are familiar with this American novel by Philip Roth, US novelist, called The Human Stain. There is also actually the movie version, okay? And just for you, I just selected this passage because I think it sort of reflects, culturally speaking, again, this issue of this association of aging as feminization, as feminizing for other men. And so, for example, one of the characters in this quote, he says, Coleman, the protagonist of the story, was unable to shield himself against the pitiful sorts of temptations with which the aging male will try to compensate for the loss of a spirited, virile manhood. Primus could tell from Coleman's demeanor that he had guessed right about the Viagra. So basically, we have already here an image in which, reflected in the novel, in a cultural product, of basically a character who sees another man, another older man's using Viagra to try to keep up with basically his sexuality and to try to prevent his, what he sees as the feminization or the decreased masculinity of older men. Now, I could use another example by Coetzee, who is this Nobel Prize winner, South Africa. There is this novel called A Slow Man, in which, again, we can see all these examples of aging as feminizing. And not only that, but also, so for example, and the other protagonist who has an accident, actually a bike accident, hence the image in the front cover, basically is not only seen as a feminization, but also we have a lot of stereotypes, sexual stereotypes, gender stereotypes associated with older men, which are also culturally dominant. So for example, we have the image of the older man as a lecherous old goat, or for example, the dirty old man, okay, which is this traditional stereotype, which is very common, the image of the older man as a diminished man, so less than a man. It says here a half man, an after man, an after image, the ghost of a man, not wholly a man, or the image of the older man being treated as a child or an idiot. So basically the infantilization of older men, which is another recurrent cultural stereotype we came up with. Now,
sorry, Jose.
I don't have more time.
Sorry, Jose, you have only 2 minutes left. Could you please start?
I'll be very, very brief. Thank you. So basically, on the one hand, we have all these images of older men as masculinities as feminizing, okay? But on the other hand, we have the what are known as continuous theory models, in which basically we have the opposite view, the view in which, unlike, if you read this quote, this is an example from a sociological article called Older Men's Blueprint for Being a Man. It says, unlike the imagery of demasculinization caused by aging, the premise we begin with is that masculinities always matter in men's lives. A striving for continuity of gender practices and identities is expected. So we have actually quite the opposite view to coexisting with the other, basically saying that older men, that they try to remain as masculine as ever, even if, or despite aging. Also, this image is reflected in many cultural products, including novels and movies. For example, I don't know if you are familiar with The Wrestler, with Mickey Rourke, for example, in which basically we have this older man who goes back to boxing after a while, or for example, The Expendables, all these movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Stallone, and so on and so forth, okay? So basically this is quite the opposite image. We have some images also here from a Swedish artist, a painter actually, who has this, Andreas Englund, who has these images of an aging superhero, basically, in which we see again the contradictions between heroism and aging, represented in these masculinity images. And basically, I would simply like to conclude that basically our idea behind the project, the main idea, was to prove again these connections, to explore the intersections between masculinities and aging, and to see, taking up Simone of Beauvoir's famous sentence in The Coming of Age, her text, which she published after The Second Sex, and in which she actually explored specifically the dynamics of aging. She said, "The whole man must be remade if we wish the old person's state to be acceptable. And I think that that's a good way to basically conclude that it's essential for us to understand masculinities better if we want other people to live a happier and better lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jose. Thanks for the quick conclusion. And we just try to be in the time frame here. And next we have Kaupo from Estonia. And Kaupo actually works as a specialist on information systems. But at the same time, he's the member of the board of the project Meeste Garaažid, which means men's shed in English. So men's shed project in Estonia. So Kaupo, could you please share us the experience of implementing men's shed philosophy in Estonia?
Hello, my name is Kaupo Lõhmus, as Heli already told. And I am very honored to be here in a very academic atmosphere as, let's say, simple men from everyday life. In terms of research of masculinity, I think I am a little bit out of topic, but anyway, as we are an organization for men, therefore we are still related to masculinity. So I am here to briefly introduce one of the first organizations of its kind in Tartu and actually in Pole, Estonia. And in Estonian, we call it Meeste Garaaž. The name Men's Garage is actually a local derivative of a more common name in the world, what is Men's Shed. It's a humorous hint for past times when men used to go their garages to get away from home or wife to spend time with other men and their cars or other techniques. In real life, garages are quite often a place for many men to hang out together. Men's Shed movement started in Australia in the late 1990s and has moved to Europe and America as well. Seed sheds normally operate on local level in the community, and they promote social interaction, and their main aim is to increase quality of life of men. Tartu Men's Shed was initiated at the end of 2016 by the common project of Tartu and Turku universities, and it was founded by EU. Project aim was to connect and activate men aged 45 and older, to give them opportunities to take part in social life. It had a strong evidence-based practices background. The movement was started because the Estonian social system is not preventative and it's mostly focused on so-called putting out fires. Middle-aged and newly retired men don't have enough opportunities to actively participate in the community, and because of that they are a vulnerable group and they run a high risk of becoming socially excluded. Loneliness is acknowledged major issue in all of Europe. The riskiest group in society is the middle-aged and elderly men withdrawn from their active working life. After losing job or retirement, men will be socially isolated. They get depressive and oftenly they start drinking. Loneliness is universal when it comes to age. Old people often feel social isolation when they retire and their social network shrinks. They become distant from ex-colleagues their friends are dying, their children's moving out, they becoming widow. Younger people might struggle with loneliness because of the mobile lifestyle of today's technology era. The loneliness problem is hidden and invisible, but very relevant, and not only in Estonia. It's a very serious cause of premature death and different illnesses. Loneliness can cause, for example, depression, dementia, diabetes, risk behavior, helplessness, and suicidal thoughts. There are all problems. These are all problems that are quite hidden in nature. The percentage of suicides in Estonia is one of the highest in Europe, and about 80% of those who decided to take their lives are men. This is on average 49-year-old men. And these are men who should be in full force, actually. It's great loss to society and all of us, actually. Unfortunately, our social system can't address those problems. And the current situation is good reason why society should react in some way. So we try to do that through our existence, through our actions. One of the main necessities of life and the basis of well-being is communication with other people, and man is human who needs meaningful relationships. Through communication, positive emotions are collected. Men's Garage offers different opportunities to create new relationships and take part in meaningful activities. The initiative of what to do comes from the men themselves. Men's Garage is not focused on one hobby. Experiences from different fields of life are shared. During the time we have been operating so far, we have organized quite few different types of activities. Here is small selection of them. For the second year in a row, our men have been going to Christmas market to offer free food to people of Tartu. This is very important because we gave something to the community and it's for free. It's important for men to feel part of the community, to act and interact with community. For example, loneliness may already lead to fears, but new exposure reduces these fears when positive experience is gained. We have met twice at the Finnish Men's Club, held summer days, and visited them last year. The exchange of experiences is an important aspect. We study how men from other countries age in their cultural context, what and how they do, what connects them. We can exchange of ideas, we can learn languages and so on. We have organized lectures on men's health and other interesting topics on several occasions. Our men also had the opportunity to use, for example, speaky language learning environment. It was very innovative and experience for men, and we want to continue to use it if possible. There is an interest in learning and developing to need to communicate. Visiting retirement homes is becoming traditional action for our men. Knowing that sense of necessity is one of a person's basic needs, this kind of action are important, especially for people in this kind of situation. Regular participation in afforestation campaigns is also very important because we did something for environment. These were just few examples of many things we have done. And finally, a little small example of what our men are doing right now. Our men are currently participating in a small project to help Tartu Maarjaküla in the framework of which one residential building will be painted over. And to my knowledge, they should be there today for one of the next stages to the work. The place I mentioned, Maarjaküla, is placed for a community in south of Estonia, where adults with intellectual disabilities live. But in the end, a little bit about our concerns. So what are our concerns? First and the most important, of course, is funding. As we depend on basically on local government funding, there is never a definite certainty as to whether or not money will be allocated to us for the next period. Another problem we have is lack of our own holy place. Currently, we are using rental space that we share with another organization. And currently, we are looking for suitable premises for our final place. What methodology to use to reach the men belonging to the target group? Men in our target group are probably one of the most difficult target groups to reach. Here we face a number of ethical issues and a number of legislative issues down to data protection and etc. We are starting one project through which we hope to collect people's stories so that they can understand what people want, what worries them, and what and how they think. So that was my little overview about us. By the way, men shared slogan "shoulder to shoulder" as adopted after the 2008 Australian Men Shared Association conference, and as abbreviated from the statement, men who talk face to face, they talk shoulder to shoulder. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaupo. Thanks for your quick overview of Men's Shed project in Estonia. I see from the chat that Naoki also has pointed out that Men's Shed is a nice action for men. Is there any evidence on its effects on health? And I hope that our next panelist, Christine, can actually give us some overview of how and if the Men's Shed movement affects men's health and well-being. So Christine Milligan is a professor of health and social geography at Lancaster University, and she's also the founding director of the university's Center for Aging Research. And her research interests are focused around health and geographical perspectives on aging, and more specifically on voluntary and community interventions to support active and healthy aging, and also informal caregiving, including male caregiving and the gender nature of care. So Christine, floor is yours. And after Christine's presentation, we have, I hope, a few minutes still for our questions and thoughts.
Great, thank you. It's quite disconcerting because you can't see me visually, unfortunately, because of the internet connection here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Christian, we can hear you very well. Don't worry.
Okay, and can you see my PowerPoint?
No, not yet. Have you started sharing your screen?
I have. Right, I'll try again.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can see it now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
If you can you choose the slideshow version of your
Yes,
PowerPoint?
I'm just looking for the.
We can see it though. Yeah.
Yep, that's it. Okay, thank
you.
Well, many thanks for inviting me, and it was great also to hear Kaupo talk just beforehand, because I think helpfully he set a lot of the scene for what I'm going to say, so I don't need to repeat much of what he's said about the background to sheds. My involvement in sheds goes back about 8 or 9 years, and I was involved in one of the first evaluations in the UK of sheds that were set up. As Kaupo said, they originated in Australia, and I think it's useful to say that in the UK, when I started looking at them 8 years ago, there were 17 sheds across the whole of the UK, with 20 more in the planning. Today, there's nearly 600 with a further 145 in development. So it just goes to show how much they have spread. And also in Australia now, there's over 1,200. So this is a massive movement, and it's great to see that they've spread not just into Europe, but clearly into Estonia and elsewhere as well. I also just wanted to pick up on something that Noki said earlier, which I thought also resonated with the work around sheds, is very much about the way in which the rationale for the promotion of sheds in the UK was very much linked to the knowledge that there were growing numbers of older men, many of whom were living alone, many of whom were experiencing loneliness and social isolation, and the known physical and mental health impacts that can have on individuals. On top of this, I think organisations like HUK that I was involved in the development of this were really concerned that although there were many community-based interventions or programmes designed to support people across the country, by and large, these were almost entirely being attended by women. The very few men were attending these, and therefore the whole concept around trying to promote sheds in the UK was very much linked to the idea of how can we find ways in which to encourage older men to engage in community-based activities. Okay, so this is just a kind of picture. I won't go into this in detail of the sorts of sheds that we had in the UK. Again, I think as Kaupo indicated, a shed can be very many things, and that depends very much on the local context, and that's really important. So a lot of them were around woodworking, but also some of them were around metalwork, some of them were around model railways, car mechanics. It would be whatever the local individual wanted to come together to do. So in looking at our study, it was largely qualitative, but incorporated mixed methods. And we did in-depth work with 60 participants across 3 different sheds who were based in very different areas in the UK. So here you can see one was in an ex-mining community, in quite a rural area. Another was in an inner city area with a high proportion of deprivation and a high proportion of Black and minority ethnic communities. And the third one was in quite a rural area in the northwest of England. So what we looked at here, and what I want to talk about in the rest of this program, talk is about the impacts of shed activity on health and well-being of older men, about alleviating loneliness and social isolation and the importance of sheds as gendered spaces. So what did we find draws older men to sheds in the first place? Most of the men heard about sheds either through newspaper articles, personal recommendations, or in some cases it was through referrals from a health or social care organisation. The appeal of the shed activity for many of the older men was linked to a significant period of change in their lives. For example, illness or bereavement. So here we've got a quote, and I don't propose to read all of these quotes I have here, but just to emphasize here, it's one about bereavement. My wife died. I used to sit at home and look at the wallpaper. I didn't feel like there was much more than that. And it got me out the house. It got me to meet other people. For others, it was about having to downsize from their homes following retirement and losing those spaces that they used to work in their own houses. So we downsized from a house to a one-bedroom flat. I lost my garage and what have you. And for others, it was very much about replacements for work and work-based relationships. And again, I think just going back to some of those comments that Noki reflected on, is that often for men, their relationships are based around their family and their work. So when they retire, they lose one whole branch of those spaces of making relationships. So the whole notion of the shed was to find some other space in which they could continue or develop new relationships. And as one said, you know, it was a place in which they met the blokes. I thought to myself, well, this is it. That's what you miss when you're at work or when you retire. It's the banter. So it's that social engagement that was important for them. The majority of people had had very busy working lives, and they talked about when they'd been at work, very many of them had been in manual or in skilled manual jobs. They'd had targets, they'd been on production lines, but they didn't particularly want that in retirement. So what they got from sheds was that feeling of going out to work and doing something productive, but an activity that was without the pressure. So here they're saying it's the activity without the pressure. You do as much as you want to, you find your own level, and we work or we don't. And they talked very much about, sometimes they'd come in and they do quite a lot of activity. So they might be producing things for the garden, or they might be producing hen runs or whatever that might be. And other times they'd come along and they didn't feel like doing that. So they would just sit down, have a cup of coffee and chat to the other men. But it was the activity of going there with a particular activity to do that was important to them. Okay, we were particularly interested in looking at the extent to which shed activity could impact on the mental well-being of older men. And this is important, not just because of the risks of loneliness and social isolation, but also because there's a significant body of evidence that demonstrates that men with a similar level of disadvantage to women experience poorer health outcomes, and that men's health-seeking behaviours are also significantly worse than those of women. And I think this is epitomised by one of our participants, where he turned around, and this is him there in the picture, when he said, "Men keep saying, I feel fine," and then they drop dead. And essentially what he's saying is that basically, you know, they just keep going, and they don't bother going for the kind of checkups and things that women are much better at doing. And while the project drew out some important issues related to older men's health and formal and informal health-seeking behaviours, what I'm focusing on here is largely the impact on mental well-being. Although I think it's important to say that you can't easily disentangle the two. So I think, as one of our participants noted, that shed activity had a positive impact on his stress-associated symptoms, such as hypertension, commenting that the positive impact of the shed on his emotional well-being and stress levels had resulted in the lowering of his blood pressure. I think the other thing that we noticed also, and again, I think Kaupo referred to at the end, is that this action of men talking to each other side by side allowed them to talk to each other about their health problems, and others was also talk about, oh yes, I had something similar to that, and this is what I did. This is what the treatment was. And these men would then quite often then go to the GPs, having had that discussion with other men and feeling somehow less stressed about the notion of going to the doctor, because those other men had also experienced it and come through it. And we ended up calling this a sort of health by stealth, and that these organizations were encouraging men to have more active health-seeking behaviors, but not in an overt way. I think where sheds had been successful in attracting lonely and isolated older men, they were seen to be providing a therapeutic and supportive environment that had positive impacts on their well-being. So Cliff, for example, felt depressed and isolated following his wife's death, and joined the shed had helped him to cope with this particularly difficult time in his life. And he says here, you know, my partner died. I was just walking around going to the shops. It's the best thing I've ever done coming up here. It was important to me. Otherwise, I don't know what I would have done. And Bob was saying, it gives me somewhere to go, keeps me busy, keeps my mind occupied and away from that health problems, because I've got nothing outside of it, you know? So in that way, it's a lifeline. I come here, I meet normal people, and I just feel better for it. For others, I think it was about cognitive stimulation, providing important mental stimulation that kept their minds active. And I thought this particular quote was particularly telling, because this chap is saying, I was losing words, not dementia, you know, the words that you normally use in conversation. You think, now what was that word? You forget that word, you know, and it's coming back now because you're chatting, you're using it, you know. So essentially what he's saying here, that for men who feel particularly lonely and socially isolated, you begin to lose that ability to communicate. You lose those conversational skills because you're not talking to anybody on a regular basis. Coming back to the shed, give them the opportunity to engage, and to use those words again, and to stimulate them cognitively. And Keith going on, you know, is thinking about how to do things. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think, I know how to do that. And then he'd talk about coming back to the shed and engaging with that the following day. For others, it was very much about a sense of purpose and self-worth, one that they had lost in retirement and moving away from work. So here we're going, it was the only thing I had control of before I did the sheds. It was the only thing I had control of before I did the sheds was the remote control for the telly. And Mike saying, it gives you worth, something that you can look forward to. So shed members not only gained a sense of self-worth from the shed activity, but it also from the sale of the items that they made, being contracted by other community organizations and individuals to build items for the community. For example, things like wheelchair ramps, an extension to a community stage, a new wooden cross for a local church, and shed members in all of the sheds referred to a sense of value and contributing towards the project and the wider community through these activities. So for some, it was giving something back to that community in exchange for the support that the organisation was giving them or a relative. And for others, it was about enabling them to donate funds raised through their activities to other charitable organisations. Important aspects of the social milieu that contributed to shed members' social inclusion and well-being, and which encouraged them to continue to participate, included a sense of camaraderie and comradeship. So the talk here about is the comradeship. It's a sense of being part of a real community. And again, the importance of the workshop activity, I think it's a vehicle for a conversation and an integration. So essentially, this was linking back to questions we were asking about, well, would this work if we just brought men together? So if men just sat down and had a cup of coffee together, would this work? And essentially they were saying no, it was the activity itself that was the stimulus and the vehicle for the success of the shared outcomes. So social interactions often take the form of banter and humour, and while this was important, they noted it was the activities themselves that were the catalyst. I think here I also wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of these as gendered spaces. I suggest at the outset that one of the core objectives underlying the SHED programme was the desire to develop an intervention.
Sorry to interrupt, Christine. We only have a few minutes left of this workshop, so could you please start concluding?
Okay. I just want to say here that I think critically what's important with older men is that for many of these men, their working lives were very much formed around lives in which the working lives were almost entirely those that engaged with other men. So having somewhere in which they can engage with men again was critically important. And I think they found it much easier to communicate with other men. So I think that masculinity issue was really important, and they talked about the lack of competition that was that they didn't find outside the workplace. And so just in concluding then, I think it's important to say that there are increasing numbers of lonely and socially isolated older men, and that presents risks for health and well-being that we need to think about. And organisations found it difficult to engage older men in non-generic, non-gender specific social activities. And I think this is important because I think one of the things that we've seen in the past has been trying to make a shift away to having non-gendered activities that engage both men and women. But I think what we've perhaps done is what we would say in the UK, thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So I think we need to be important about that. And we're saying that sheds offer one gendered space in which older men can still perform their masculinity while also providing space for the promotion and maintenance of health and well-being. And then we talk about this notion of also health by stealth. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Christine, for such a quick presentation. It was really interesting. I think a lot of us would have liked to actually continue the presentation. But I'm the referee here, and we only have 4 minutes left. And meanwhile, in chat, there's been a discussion between Magnus Jakobsson and Miranda, and there was really interesting questions raised by Magnus, and I think one of the questions we might even maybe Miranda could answer it so that everybody else can also hear her interpretation or her answer to the question. So Magnus asks from Miranda whether the urge to genderize on self diminishes by age. Do you think it becomes less important with age? So I don't know, how would you respond to that, Miranda?
It's a very interesting question. I think we have to be sometimes a little bit careful in this binary coding of men and women. And I think current gender research is fighting that quite distinctly. Of course, we see a rift between what's happening in academia and maybe what's happening in people's everyday lives. But I think if we look at the quite large literature now available on older men and masculinities in later life, it shows very clearly, especially if we look at the qualitative work, that there's actually quite a few men out there who will reflect on their lives and will be quite open about the fact that they've actually always found the kind of masculinity that was ascribed to them it was actually quite difficult for them to enact it. And I mean, that's at the principle of the concept of hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is not a rule of behaviors that men enact in order to become powerful. It's a description of the power relationships among men and between men and women in a society that can be described as a patriarchy. So, and I think that's always the misunderstanding that takes place. Hegemonic masculinity is seen as problematic masculinity, is seen as a set of behaviors. That's not what hegemonic masculinity is. So if we take it from a more conceptual basis, we can then look at, you know, how do men enact these power relationships, and where do they actually relinquish these power relationships? And age, in a sense, because they step out of the productive sphere, they step out of work, it requires them to find something else. And we've heard this in nearly every talk in this workshop. And for some, it actually enables, in combination with a heightened sense of agency in later life. So later life no longer as a phase where you get your pipe out and you put your slippers on and, you know, you sit somewhere and you wait for time to pass. Actually now as a time of trying out new things, continuing to be an active consumer, whether it's, you know, very strong on the consumer side or being involved in other things, looking after grandchildren, that kind of thing, that men are finding these other areas in which to enact masculinity, and that then looks quite different. You know, I think we have multiple masculinities. I think it's really important to always use the plural because there is no one masculinity, and that we see a bit of movement between this binary of men and women. And I mean, I know in terms of research, we need to have categories and you have to grasp it somehow. But if we always refer to it as that is masculine and that is feminine, we'll never get out of this kind of binary contradiction that we've set up. And I think that's why I was looking at care, because I think actually this care work is a lovely example of men being pushed in, of finding it, of experimenting with it, and allowing them to try out something new. And if they have a positive experience, then they stick with it. And there's a certain sense of having achievement. What I don't want to stress is sort of this point of that men feel they have to succeed or they have to do it in a technical way. We've had the research on that, and I think that leads us somehow into just a one alleyway. I think it's important to look at what are they doing it, what meanings do they attach to it, and what does that tell us about changing masculinities, shifting. I think it's all very tentative. I wouldn't say it's going in one direction. There's a lot going on. If we make it a bit more visible, it might allow other men to follow that path as well, if you look at it from a more policy perspective, maybe.
Yes, thank you, Miranda. I think we have time just for one more question from the audience. Could you please raise your hand, or if there is anybody interested to ask anything from the panelists? Yes, Ted, please, go ahead.
Well, I kind of raised my question there then, that what is then like specifically masculine about it, if we're talking about care? And I mean, if it would be done by a woman, then we would call it feminine. So I mean, I have a why this, yeah, I guess it's again to do with being human in the first place, but if yeah, could you explain a little on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, I think if you look at feminist theory about care work, it's the stance, and this was done in the 1980s, is to say care work is not work that women do, but actually it's a human norm. Nancy Fraser speaks of a human norm that everyone requires. You know, as a human being, we are completely reliant on people caring for us, especially at young ages when we get ill, but also we need people to look after our children when we go to work. We have older people who are at heightened need of care. So throughout our entire lifespan, we are in need of care. But this care work is often very invisible, historically, because it's been done by women unpaid for. And now we have a care work sector that is massive. You know, COVID has shown us how reliant we are on care work and how badly we pay it, and how badly the resources are, and how strong it is still within the sphere of women. And the power relationships that exist there. So in a sense, I agree with you that it's called caring masculinities is not ideal. I think what it's trying to promote is it's to promote an idea that men can care. So, and hopefully, maybe in 10 years' time, we don't need it anymore. I think it's a bridging concept for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again for all the panelists, again for all the participants for being patient and getting over the technical problems here. Thanks for the interesting discussions, and I hope those discussions gave you fruitful thoughts for tonight, and I hope to see you again tomorrow at the conference. So have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.